Have you ever stopped to think about just how many different ways there are to actually form a family?
It's a question that pops up, right?
Yeah, and it usually brings up, the sort of traditional images, but the reality, as we're going to really get into today, is, well, it's way more diverse, way more complex, and really profoundly human.
Hmm.
So today we're embarking on a real deep dive into the world of adoption. We're moving beyond just the heartwarming stories you often hear.
Right, the surface level stuff.
Exactly. To really understand the intricate social, emotional, and importantly, the legal processes that kind of weave these new family tapestries together.
And there's a lot to weave.
Oh, definitely. Our mission today is to thoroughly unpack this whole journey of adoption. We're looking at the specific pathways children take to find new homes, the vital support systems that absolutely have to be in place,
Crucial.
and the unique developmental and psychological considerations that shape these children and their families. And we're drawing directly from the authoritative Nelson textbook of Pediatrics.
A foundational text, really.
It really is, to give you an understanding that goes, way beyond just surface level info.
And what's truly fascinating here, and what we really want to illuminate, is just how deeply intertwined the medical, the social, and the legal aspects of adoption actually are.
Yeah.
This isn't just like a single event or transaction. It's a whole comprehensive ecosystem. And as we look at the material, mostly from Chapter 9 on domestic and international adoption,
Right.
we'll also be connecting it to that broader context of the child welfare system, foster care, which is detailed in Chapter 10. Understanding these connections, these intricate links, is absolutely crucial if you want to grasp the full picture and really master this complex field.
Absolutely. Johnson's provides this incredibly rich, evidence-based foundation for our deep dive today. We'll be meticulously exploring its insights into both domestic and international adoption, and, like you said, its close cousin, foster and kinship care. And this isn't about just memorizing facts. It's about building a really nuanced, interconnected understanding of how families are formed, how they're supported, and nurtured through these specific pathways.
Building that framework.
Exactly. By the end of this deep dive, you, our listener, will possess a level of understanding about adoption that's usually, frankly, reserved for the elite professionals in the field.
That's the goal.
You'll grasp the critical, multifaceted role of medical professionals, the profound developmental considerations unique to adopted children, and precisely how adoption fits within that broader dynamic framework of the foster care system.
What is adoption? Defining the landscape and demographics.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Let's unpack this foundational concept. What exactly is adoption?
Right. At its core, the textbook defines adoption as, well, it's a social, an emotional, and a legal process.
All three.
All three. It's the mechanism, the way a child gets a new permanent family when their family of origin is either unable or sometimes unwilling to provide that parental care.
And it's more than just moving, right? It's a fundamental shift.
Oh, absolutely. It's not just changing addresses. It's a profound transition that legally and emotionally completely redefines a child's family structure. It creates these new lifelong bonds.
And when you look at the scale of this in the U.S., it's actually pretty significant.
It really is. The numbers are quite telling. Approximately 1.5 million children under 18 in the U.S. are adopted.
Wow.
Which translates roughly to about 2% to 4% of American families having adopted a child. So it touches a lot of lives.
And annually, what are we looking at?
Annually, the figure is around 135,000 children finding permanent homes through adoption each year in the U.S.
So 135,000 kids a year. Where are these children coming from primarily?
Okay, so when we break down the origins, we see a pretty distinct landscape, and
Right.
each pathway has its own, characteristics and challenges.
Makes sense.
The largest segment, by far, accounts for a substantial 59%. That originates from the child welfare system, what most people just call foster care.
Okay, the foster system.
Right. These are typically kids who've been removed from their birth families because of safety concerns, neglect, abuse.
Yeah.
And after efforts for reunification haven't worked out, adoption becomes that path to permanency.
Got it. So that's the biggest chunk. What else?
Then another significant portion, about 25%, comes from other countries. That's international adoption.
Okay.
And these kids often have very different backgrounds, sometimes having lived in orphanages or other institutional settings for extended periods.
Right, different early experiences.
Exactly. And then 15% are voluntarily relinquished American babies. These are often infants whose birth parents make an adoption plan right at or very shortly after birth.
So a direct placement, more or less.
Often, yes. The remaining few percentages cover various other pathways. Things like adoptions facilitated through private agencies, which might handle both domestic and international. Adoptions involving American indigenous nations, which have their own specific tribal laws, like the Indian Child Welfare Act, ICWA.
Very important distinction.
Absolutely critical. And then you have cases like step-parent adoptions or other forms of kinship care, where maybe an aunt, uncle, grandparent assumes legal parentage.
So a real variety of pathways.
A huge variety. And each of these origins presents really unique medical, social, and emotional considerations. Kids from foster care, for example, often carry histories of trauma or neglect.
Which needs specific support.
Definitely. Internationally adopted children might have faced institutionalization challenges affecting development. Voluntarily relinquished infants might have fewer early adversities in that sense, but still need really careful attachment support with their new family.
That breakdown really does highlight the diversity, doesn't it? And you mentioned international adoption, speaking of landscapes changing. There have been some really significant shifts there, right? Especially over the last, 15 years or so?
Oh, absolutely dramatic shifts. We've seen a really steep decrease in the number of children adopted internationally.
Why is that?
Well, it's not just a minor blip. It's a trend driven by some fundamental changes in policies and, frankly, broader social dynamics within the countries children were coming from, the sending countries.
So changes within those countries themselves.
Exactly. What we're really witnessing is a kind of global paradigm shift. Many nations are increasingly, and rightly, prioritizing keeping children within their own borders, within their own cultural context. They're trying to support biological families or find domestic care options whenever possible. And the result is fewer children are becoming available for inter-country adoption. And the ones who are available often tend to have more complex needs or are older.
So the profile of the child is changing too.
Profoundly. And this shift impacts the entire global adoption ecosystem. For instance, it means domestic agencies, say here in the U.S., are increasingly focusing their resources and recruitment efforts on kids within our own child welfare systems. They're adapting to this new reality of just fewer international opportunities. And this isn't just, a random policy choice. It often reflects a strengthening of child welfare systems abroad and a growing emphasis on national identity and culture in many countries.
That reframing is really helpful for understanding the bigger picture. And when we look at the ecosystem of adoption agencies within the U.S., it's also quite varied, isn't it?
Very much so. Public agencies, these are typically your state or county-run child welfare departments. They actually support about half, 50% of all annual adoptions.
Okay, so the public system handles the bulk.
Primarily, yes, especially for kids coming out of foster care.
Yeah.
Then you have private agencies. They facilitate about 25% of adoptions. These often handle those voluntary relinquishments we talked about, or maybe specific international adoptions that are still happening.
Gotcha.
And finally, independent practitioners, like adoption lawyers, they manage about 15% of adoptions, particularly in direct placements between birth parents and adoptive parents, or things like step-parent adoptions.
So if you're a prospective parent, this means navigating a pretty complex network, right?
Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture for you, the listener thinking about this distribution shows a really complex, multi-layered network that families have to navigate.
Yeah.
The specific path a family chooses, or maybe the path that's best suited for them, will determine which type of agency or practitioner they work with. And that, in turn, dictates which regulatory frameworks and support systems they'll encounter.
Right. Different rules, different supports.
Precisely. Public agencies, for example, typically work with families adopting kids with significant needs from foster care, and they often provide financial subsidies to help support those kids.
That makes sense.
Private agencies might offer more tailored, maybe quicker services for, say, infant adoption, but often at a higher cost. This whole complex network, though, ultimately demonstrates a societal commitment, albeit through these diverse channels, to making sure children find safe and permanent homes.
Now, here's a statistic that really jumped out at me, and it profoundly shapes our understanding, I think. Approximately 39% of adopted children have special healthcare needs. Compare that to just 19% of the general child population. When you hear a number like that, 39% versus 19%. I mean, what does that immediately tell us about the population of children entering adoptive families? And maybe more importantly, the depth of support they might need.
That statistic is absolutely critical. It's huge because it immediately signals that adoptive families are, more often than not, embarking on a journey that's going to involve navigating pretty significant medical, developmental, or behavioral health considerations.
It's not just a possibility, it's probable.
It's highly probable.
Yeah.
It fundamentally shifts that common perception of adoption from being solely a social process to one that's intricately linked with often complex medical and psychosocial histories.
Right.
It implies that these children often carry unique histories of early adversity. Maybe it's prenatal exposures, maybe it's neglect, trauma, genetic predispositions, things that require specialized and ongoing attention.
It's not a one-and-done checkup.
Not at all. It's about long-term, informed, and often multidisciplinary care that extends throughout the child's life, infancy, adolescence, even into adulthood sometimes.
Yeah.
And it also just highlights the urgent need for a really robust support infrastructure for adoptive families because they are uniquely stepping up to meet these profound needs.
Domestic adoption, policy, pathways, and evolving family structures.
Okay, let's dive into domestic adoption policies now. One really pivotal piece of legislation that comes up again and again is the Adoption and Safe Families Act, ANSA-FA, often called PL 10589.
ANSA-FA, very important.
Why is it so foundational?
Well, ANSA-FA is foundational because it imposes a specific legal requirement. It says children in foster care must be placed with adoptive families if they cannot be safely reunited with their birth families within a reasonable specified time frame.
So it puts a clock on things in a way.
Exactly. It really solidifies that direct link between the foster care system and adoption, placing permanency for children as a primary urgent goal. Before ANSA-FA, kids could sometimes drift in foster care for years without a clear plan.
ASFA was a real game changer because it shifted the focus from potentially indefinite foster care towards timely permanency. It established specific timelines, for instance, requiring a permanency plan like adoption or guardianship to be made for a child no later than 12 months after they enter foster care.
1 year.
1 year for the plan. And furthermore, it mandated that a petition to actually terminate parental rights, or TPR, generally must be filed when a child has been in foster care for at least 15 of the previous 22 months.
15 out of 22 months.
Right, unless there are specific exceptions, like if the child is placed with a relative. This legislative push really aims to prevent children from just languishing in the system. It ensures that if reunification isn't possible, that path to a new permanent family through adoption is pursued, expeditiously.
Right.
It really reflects a societal recognition that stability and permanence are just paramount for a child's healthy development. And when we look at the actual foster care dynamics and the outcomes, the numbers kind of paint a vivid picture of these pathways AFA influenced. So in fiscal year 2020, there were about 407,000 kids in foster care?
Roughly, yes. And about 117,000 of those were actively waiting for adoption, meaning TPR had likely occurred or was in process.
Okay. And of the kids who left foster care that year, about 224,000, what happened to them?
Well, the good news is that 48%, almost half, were successfully reunited with their parents or primary caretakers. That's always the first goal.
Always the preference?
Always. But a significant 25% were adopted, which really underscores adoption's vital role in achieving permanency when reunification just isn't possible or safe.
A quarter of exits are through adoption.
Right. And if we drill down into 2021 specifically, of the roughly 53,500 children adopted that year, a really striking 55% were adopted by their foster parent.
Over half.
Over half. And another 34% were adopted by relatives.
Wow. So foster parents and relatives make up almost 90% of adoptions from foster care.
Exactly, which immediately raises that important question. What makes foster parents and relatives so incredibly crucial in these domestic adoptions?
Why them specifically?
Well, that's a critical observation, and the answer really lies in the profound benefits of continuity and established relationships for the child.
Okay.
I mean, imagine a child who's already been through the trauma of being removed from their birth family. If they can then transition to a permanent home with caregivers they already know and trust.
Huge difference.
Huge. Whether it's a foster parent who's provided consistent, loving care for months or even years, or a relative, like a grandparent or an aunt who provides that connection to their biological family, their roots, their cultural heritage, it significantly minimizes additional trauma.
Less disruption.
Way less disruption.
Right.
This continuity helps foster secure attachment, which we know is just fundamental for a child's emotional and psychological well-being. It means less uncertainty and often a much smoother transition into permanent family life because you're building on an already existing foundation of care and affection.
That makes so much sense. But while the system aims for permanency, especially with foster parents and relatives, there are still significant barriers, right? Barriers that disproportionately affect some of the most vulnerable children, making them less likely to be adopted quickly or sometimes at all.
Sadly, yes. The source, the textbook, specifically identifies several groups who often wait longer. School-aged children, for one.
Older kids.
Older kids, sibling groups who ideally should stay together but are harder to place as a unit.
Right, finding a family for multiple kids is tougher.
Definitely. Also, members of historically oppressed racial and ethnic groups, and children with considerable physical, emotional, or developmental needs.
So what does this tell us about maybe the systemic challenges embedded here? Why do these kids wait the longest?
Well, these demographics reveal some deep-seated systemic challenges. For school-age kids, prospective parents often, frankly, prefer infants or younger children. Older kids might also come with more complex behavioral histories stemming from past adversity.
Understandable, but challenging.
Right. Sibling groups, as you said, just inherently present a higher placement challenge. Families need the space, the resources, the capacity for multiple children at once.
Yeah.
For children of color, the issue is really multifaceted. It can involve implicit bias within the child welfare system itself. It can be a lack of ethnically diverse adoptive parents being actively recruited or identified, or sometimes cultural competence gaps among agencies or social workers.
And complex.
Very. And children with those complex physical, emotional, or developmental needs, they require a unique level of commitment, significant resources, and often very specialized knowledge from adoptive families. That understandably narrows the pool of eligible parents who feel equipped for that.
Right.
So these aren't just about individual preferences of adoptive parents. They really highlight these profound societal and systemic barriers that child welfare agencies are actively trying to grapple with, and they often reflect broader disparities in resources, support, and equity in our society.
It's encouraging, though, that there are policy efforts aimed directly at trying to expand adoption opportunities for these specific groups of vulnerable children.
Yes, thankfully. There are several key efforts. Federal adoption subsidies, for instance. These provide ongoing financial assistance to adoptive families, particularly those adopting children with special needs from foster care, to help meet those needs.
It helps offset the costs.
Exactly. There are also federal adoption tax credits designed to help offset some of the often significant costs associated with the adoption process itself, like legal fees or agency fees. There are also targeted recruitment efforts trying to identify ethnically diverse adults willing to adopt, aiming to better match children with families of similar backgrounds, or at least provide culturally competent care.
That seems crucial for identity.
It really is. And increased replacement services are also vital. This means offering more support, training, and preparation for both the child and the prospective adoptive parents before a placement is finalized, trying to ensure a better fit and smoother transition.
So setting families up for success.
That's the idea. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, these policy efforts aren't just about, boosting the numbers. They really reflect a societal recognition of profound need to support diverse families and to meet the complex needs of children who've often experienced significant adversity.
Right.
The subsidies, for example, acknowledge the very real financial burden of raising children with special needs. Recruitment efforts aim to create more culturally congruent placements, which, as you said, can be vital for a child's sense of identity and belonging.
Yeah.
And furthermore, a really significant trend has been the expansion of eligibility criteria for adoption in many places, allowing single adults, older couples, and increasingly gay and lesbian partners to adopt.
Opening the doors wider.
Exactly. This broader eligibility significantly widens the pool of potential loving homes, recognizing that, at the end of the day, a stable, nurturing environment is paramount, regardless of the parent's marital status, age, or sexual orientation.
And speaking of expanding eligibility, the growing acceptance of same-sex couple adoption is, it's truly remarkable and positive development highlighted in the text.
It really is.
It's now legally recognized in, over a dozen countries globally?
Yeah.
And while the specifics still vary state by state here in the U.S.,
Unfortunately, yes, still some patchwork.
we're seeing increasing numbers of gay and lesbian partners being able to adopt children. Current estimates suggest over 2 million children in the U.S. are being raised by gay or lesbian parents. That includes about 5% of all adopted children.
Significant number.
It is. And this covers kids adopted domestically, from foster care, internationally. So here's the really interesting part. What does the actual research tell us about the well-being of these children?
This is where the evidence becomes absolutely compelling, as the textbook emphasizes. The research on the well-being of children raised by same-sex couples is extensive. It's been done over decades, and it is remarkably consistent.
Okay, and what does it show?
It indicates, with very strong evidence, that these children are just as physically and psychologically healthy, just as capable, and just as successful as children raised by opposite-sex couples.
So no difference in outcomes based on parental sexual orientation.
Essentially, no. This data is profoundly important because it directly challenges and dismantles those old biases and stereotypes. It underscores that a child's well-being is overwhelmingly determined by the quality of the parenting, the stability of the home environment, the economic resources available, not by the sexual orientation of their parents.
Quality of parenting, not orientation.
Precisely. And pediatricians also play a vital ethical role here. The American Academy of Pediatrics, for instance, strongly advocates for these children by actively supporting gay and lesbian parents, recognizing their families as equally valid and capable, and ensuring they receive the same comprehensive care and resources as any other family. It's about focusing squarely on the child's best interest, above all else.
Shifting gears slightly within domestic adoption, but still related to family structure, it's important to understand the concept of open adoption. What is that exactly?
Right. Open adoption is a model usually facilitated through an adoption agency or sometimes privately arranged, where the birth mother and sometimes other birth family members continue to have some form of limited, ongoing involvement with the legally adoptive family.
So contact continues after the adoption is finalized.
Yes, some level of contact. This can occur in various situations, like through surrogacy agreements sometimes, but maybe more commonly, it arises in cases of unplanned pregnancy where the birth mother chooses adoption but wishes to maintain some connection to her child and their new family.
That model immediately raises an important question. What are the potential benefits, but also maybe the complexities of an open adoption for everyone involved, the child, the adoptive parents, the birth parents?
That's an excellent question because open adoption is definitely a nuanced arrangement. For the child, it can actually be incredibly beneficial. Well, it can provide a much clearer understanding of their origins, their story. It can reduce potential feelings of abandonment or confusion about their history. It offers a sense of continuity, knowing where they came from.
So less mystery.
Less mystery and often a connection to their roots. For the adoptive parents, it can foster greater empathy and understanding of the child's background. And critically, it often provides invaluable direct access to the child's medical and genetic history, which can be crucial for long-term health planning.
That's a huge practical benefit.
Huge. And for the birth mother or birth family, it can offer a profound sense of peace and closure, knowing her child is loved and cared for, and that she can still have a defined, hopefully healthy connection to their life.
But you mentioned complexities.
Right. It definitely introduces complexities.
Yeah.
Navigating clear boundaries, managing expectations on all sides, ensuring consistent and respectful communication. These are paramount to prevent misunderstandings or distress for any party, especially the child.
It requires a lot of maturity.
A very high degree of maturity, trust, flexibility, and commitment from everyone involved to make it a truly positive experience, centered on the child's needs and well-being. It's not always easy, but when it works well, it can be very beneficial.
Intercountry adoption. Global insights and challenges.
Okay, let's move beyond our borders now and talk about intercountry adoption. Historically, it served this global purpose, right? Providing stable, long-term care for vulnerable children around the world.
That was certainly the ideal, yes.
But alongside that noble purpose, the source, Nelson's, highlights some really significant and frankly disturbing concerns that arose.
Very serious concerns.
It mentions the rapid growth of international adoption in some countries of origin, especially during peak periods, tragically outpacing adequate regulation and oversight. And this apparently opened the door for some serious abuses.
Indeed. It's unfortunately a dark chapter in the history of intercountry adoption in some places and times. The opportunities for financial gain, sadly, led to deeply unethical and illegal practices.
Like what specifically?
Well, we're talking about things like the outright sale and abduction of children, where vulnerable children were literally treated as commodities, bought and sold.
Horrifying.
Absolutely. There were documented instances of bribery of officials to falsify documents or expedite processes, and even financial coercion of birth families, where desperate parents were pressured, manipulated, or misled into relinquishing their children for adoption under false pretenses, maybe promised ongoing contact that never happened, or told their child would have opportunities that weren't realistic.
And how widespread was this?
That's the profound difficulty, as the textbook notes. Ascertaining the full extent and scope of these concerns is incredibly hard, precisely because these illicit activities are often hidden, they go unreported, and they can become deeply ingrained in systems where oversight is weak or corruption is present.
Right.
It just underscores the immense vulnerability of both the children and their birth families in these contexts, and exactly why robust international safeguards became so absolutely vital.
So, to address these profound concerns and try to put stricter ethical frameworks in place, there was this concerted global effort, right? Notably through the Hague Convention.
Yes, the Hague Convention on Protection of Children and Cooperation in Respect of Intercountry Adoption. That was a landmark international treaty.
What did it aim to do?
Fundamentally, it aims to safeguard children involved in intercountry adoption. It promotes political cooperation between nations and, crucially, established a framework of international law explicitly designed to reduce the potential for child abduction, child trafficking, and other illicit practices.
Putting protections in place.
Exactly. Its core principle, which really cannot be overstated, is to ensure that the best interests of the child are paramount in every single decision-making process related to intercountry adoption.
The child comes first.
Always. Participating nations, including the United States, are obligated under the convention to establish central authorities to oversee adoptions and ensure they meet strict ethical guidelines and procedural safeguards.
And did it change the perspective on international adoption?
It fundamentally shifted the perspective. It reinforces the idea of international adoption as an option of last resort.
Last resort. What does that mean in practice?
It means it should only be considered after all viable options for care within the child's family of origin, including extended relatives or within their own national culture, have been thoroughly explored and deemed unsuitable.
So, domestic solutions first.
Absolutely. The convention also emphasizes the responsibility of nations to address the underlying socio-political conditions. Poverty, lack of health care, lack of support for families that create the need for out-of-family care in the first place. Trying to support children within their own countries whenever possible.
That concept, international adoption as a measure of last resort, seems absolutely crucial for understanding the current landscape then.
It is. It signifies a global consensus, enshrined in international law for signatory countries, that a child should only be adopted internationally if they genuinely cannot be cared for within their birth family, their extended family, their immediate community, or their larger national culture.
And this shift has had a direct impact, right, on the children who are now being adopted internationally into countries like the U.S.
Precisely. This shift means that internationally adopted children today are far more likely to enter their new families at older ages. And critically, they often come with more complex medical, developmental, or social-emotional needs than perhaps was typical in previous decades.
So the profile changed significantly.
Dramatically. The profile of the average internationally adopted child has shifted significantly from the typically healthy infants that characterized many international adoptions, say, 20 or 30 years ago. These children today often bring with them histories of significant early adversity, maybe from institutionalization, neglect, trauma, profound family disruption.
Which means adoptive parents need to be prepared differently.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It underscores the need for prospective adoptive parents to be incredibly well prepared, educated, and supported, and for agencies to thoroughly assess and disclose the comprehensive needs these children present, ensuring families are making informed choices and are equipped for the journey.
And the decline in the actual numbers reflects this last resort approach, right? It's been quite stark.
Oh, incredibly stark. In 2021, for example, U.S. families adopted only about 1,785 children from other countries.
1,785.
Compared to the peak in 2004, which was nearly 23,000 children. 22,884 to be exact.
Wow, that's a massive drop.
A huge decline. The top sending countries in 2021, representing about 65% of those adoptions to the U.S., were places like Bulgaria, Colombia, India, Nigeria, South Korea, and Ukraine.
And China used to be a major source, right?
It did. Notably, 2021 marked the first year since 1984 where no children were adopted into the U.S. from China, which was once, for many years, the largest single-sending country.
That's a huge shift, and what's fascinating, as you mentioned, is the background many of these children now share.
Yeah, while every child's story is unique, the textbook highlights that most children placed for international adoption today have some history of poverty and significant social hardship in their countries of origin. A significant number are adopted from orphanages or other institutional care settings. And it's important to understand how they got there. Many young infants, for instance, are placed into orphanage care shortly after birth, often due to extreme parental poverty, lack of social support, or maybe disability.
Right.
Older children often enter care because of profound family disruption, maybe parental illness, death, the devastating impact of war, or natural disasters that just obliterate family and community support systems.
Or abuse and neglect.
Or, yes, still others come into orphanage care after official determinations of significant abuse or neglect within their biological families, leading to their removal for safety.
And these early life circumstances, especially being in an institution, they have lasting impacts, right?
Profound and lasting impacts,
Wrong.
particularly institutionalization. As the textbook stresses, the effects of institutional care, often compounded by other life stresses like malnutrition, neglect, or separation from any consistent caregiver, can profoundly affect all areas of a child's growth and development.
All areas.
Yes, physical growth, cognitive abilities, language development, social emotional regulation, brain development. It's pervasive. And this is precisely why many of these children require highly specialized support and a deep, trauma-informed understanding from their adoptive families and all the professionals involved to help them overcome the impact of that stress and early adversity and ultimately reach their full potential.
Which brings us squarely to the absolutely crucial and often challenging role of pediatricians in providing that comprehensive care throughout the entire adoption journey.
The pivotal role of pediatricians, pre-adoption medical insights.
Okay, so when we talk about the pivotal role of pediatricians in adoption, it's really not just about what happens after a child is placed in a new home, right? Their guidance starts much, much earlier.
That's absolutely right. It ideally begins well before the adoption is finalized. Pre-adoption medical record reviews are an essential step, really vital for both domestic and international adoptions whenever possible,
Why are they so important?
because they provide crucial information. Adoption agencies, particularly in domestic adoption, are making increasing efforts to obtain comprehensive biological, family health information, and genetic histories to share with prospective adoptive families.
Getting that background info.
Exactly. And this information is crucial because it empowers families with knowledge. It helps them understand potential predispositions the child might have, existing medical conditions, or genetic risks they might carry.
And this isn't just about infancy, right?
No, not at all. What's fascinating here is that this kind of information often becomes increasingly relevant as the child gets older. It can impact long-term care decisions, influence screening protocols for certain conditions down the line, and just generally gives parents a fuller, more informed picture of their child's medical heritage, allowing for more proactive health management throughout their life.
And recognizing these unique and often complex needs, the field of adoption medicine itself has really grown, hasn't it?
It really has. It's become a vital subspecialty. Specialty clinics have been established across the U.S. specifically designed to address the unique medical and developmental needs of adopted children.
And this is a direct connection to you, the listener, right? These clinics are out there.
Absolutely. These clinics are invaluable resources for adoptive families, not just at the beginning, but potentially throughout the adopted child's entire life, offering expertise that a general pediatrician might not have.
So, what do these adoption medicine pediatricians specifically do for prospective parents?
Well, when available, these specialists provide highly focused expertise. Their specific role is to meticulously help prospective adoptive parents understand a child's often intricate health and developmental history. They review all the available background information, whether it's from birth families, foster care records, or international orphanage files.
Sifting through everything.
Sifting through everything, trying to piece it together. They assess both the actual known medical and psychosocial risk factors and also potential risks based on the history or lack thereof. The ultimate goal is to empower the prospective parents to make truly informed decisions about their family's capacity and preparedness to parent a specific waiting child. It's about ensuring a realistic and well-supported journey ahead.
But while those pre-adoption reviews are crucial, navigating international medical records sounds like it presents a whole unique set of really profound complexities.
Oh, absolutely. It's a huge challenge. Under the Hague Convention, U.S. agencies arranging international adoptions are legally mandated to strive for accurate and complete health histories on children awaiting adoption.
Strive for. But is it always possible?
That's the problem. What's often encountered is just a wide and deeply problematic variability in the nature and quality of the medical and genetic information provided, if it's provided at all.
What kind of problems?
Well, it's common to encounter things like incongruous translations, where medical terms are poorly or incorrectly translated, leading to significant misinterpretations. You might see unfamiliar medical terminology for conditions or medications that simply aren't recognized or used by U.S. trained physicians, adding layers of confusion.
So you can't even be sure what they're saying sometimes.
Exactly. This creates a massive challenge for accurate assessment. Therefore, and this is critically important, the textbook stresses this repeatedly. Results of specific diagnostic studies and lab tests performed outside the United States should not be relied upon. They absolutely must be repeated once the child arrives in the U.S.
Don't trust the overseas labs. Repeat everything.
Repeat everything pertinent. Paradoxically, a thorough review of a child's existing medical records from abroad may often raise more questions than it provides answers. Each diagnosis listed needs exceptionally careful consideration, cross-referencing with any other available info, and often complete reevaluation upon arrival.
Can you give an example?
Sure. A diagnosis of, say, failure to thrive on an orphanage record. What does that actually mean? It might mean severe, measurable malnutrition. Or it could just be a catch-all term used in that institution for any child not meeting expected growth milestones for any number of reasons. So further investigation is essential.
Okay. What about growth charts?
Another key point. Country-specific growth curves should be explicitly avoided for institutionalized children. They often don't accurately reflect the demographic realities or the challenging nutritional status of these vulnerable kids. Instead, any available serial growth data, height, weight, head circumference, should always be plotted on standard U.S. growth curves, like the WHO or CDC curves.
Why?
Because plotting on U.S. curves can powerfully reveal patterns of poor growth, stunting, or wasting that might be masked by local charts, pointing towards underlying malnutrition or chronic illness that needs urgent attention.
Got it. What if there are hardly any records? What else can be useful?
Sometimes, frankly, the only truly objective information available comes from recent photographs or maybe video files of the child.
Pictures and videos.
Yes. Full-face photographs, for example, can be invaluable. They might reveal subtle dysmorphic features consistent with something like fetal alcohol syndrome or other congenital disorders, providing crucial early clues to potential diagnoses that sparse written records would completely miss. Videos can give a sense of motor skills, interaction, alertness.
So visual information can be key.
It can be surprisingly informative when records are poor.
Given all these complexities, potential ambiguities, missing information, the healthcare provider's role during this pre-adoption phase needs to be very clear and impartial, right?
Absolutely crystal clear. They are ethically bound to share frank, honest, unvarnished interpretations of all the available medical and developmental information, including the limitations of that information, with the prospective adoptive parents.
And here's that crucial distinction the textbook makes.
Yes, and it's critical. The provider's role is not to comment on the advisability of a specific adoption. They shouldn't be telling a family, yes, you should adopt this child, or no, this child has too many issues for you.
That's not their job.
It's not their job. Their precise role is to fully inform the prospective parents of any significant medical, developmental, and behavioral health needs that have been clearly identified or that are reasonably anticipated based on the child's history or background.
So what does this all mean for you, the prospective parent listening?
It means it's all about empowering you with knowledge. It's about providing you with all the necessary medical data and insights, stripped of opinion or judgment, including the uncertainties, so that you can make the most informed and realistic decision for your unique family.
You make the choice based on the facts.
Exactly. It's about transparency and support, ensuring families are as prepared as possible for the full spectrum of their potential child's needs, both the knowns and the possible unknowns.
The pivotal role of pediatricians. Post-adoption care, and ongoing developmental consideration.
Okay, so the family has made the decision, they've navigated the process, and now the internationally adopted child has arrived in the United States. That arrival visit with the pediatrician, it's not just recommended, it's mandatory.
Right. Mandatory and absolutely critical. All internationally adopted children need a thorough, comprehensive medical evaluation very shortly after arriving in the U.S., usually within the first couple of weeks.
And this isn't just a standard well-child check.
Not at all. It's an intensive assessment specifically designed to detect potential acute or chronic medical problems that might not have been immediately evident, or were maybe misdiagnosed, or simply weren't adequately addressed prior to the child's arrival.
What kind of things are commonly found?
The list of common, potentially undetected issues is unfortunately quite extensive, and they can be profoundly impactful if missed. It includes things like rampant malnutrition, various growth deficiencies that might persist even with better feeding, intestinal stool pathogens, parasites, bacteria that can cause chronic diarrhea, pain, and poor absorption.
Okay, serious gut issues.
Very common. Also, anemia, often iron deficiency anemia from poor diet, elevated blood lead levels from environmental exposures in their home country or institution. Significant dental decay is almost universal in some populations. Vision impairments like strabismus or crossed eyes, which can lead to permanent vision loss if not treated. Undiagnosed birth defects. And crucially, significant developmental delays across various domains: motor, language, cognitive.
And behavioral things, too.
Yes, very often. Feeding difficulties, sensory processing issues, and significant social-emotional concerns related to attachment disruptions, trauma, or neglect. These all require immediate and sensitive attention.
So that arrival visit kicks off a lot of screening.
It absolutely does. Following that initial comprehensive history and physical exam, extensive screening protocols are immediately put into place. These draw heavily from detailed guidelines like those meticulously outlined in tables 9.1 and 9.2 of the Nelson textbook.
What do those protocols stress?
They stress a broad battery of screenings. Infectious diseases are a major focus, also disorders of growth, development, vision, and hearing.
Can you give an example, like TB?
Yes, tuberculosis screening is absolutely required for all internationally adopted children, regardless of any prior screening or BCG vaccination status. This is done using either a tuberculin skin test, TST, or an interferon gamma release assay, IGRA blood test.
Even if they had a test before they came?
Yes, because prior tests, especially skin tests done overseas, can be unreliable or improperly interpreted. And critically, if a child's initial TST is negative, it must be repeated in 4 to 6 months.
Why repeat a negative test?
Because children who have experienced significant poor nutrition or chronic illness can have a suppressed immune response, a state called anergy, which can lead to false negative results initially. Repeating it ensures you don't miss latent TB infection.
Oh, okay. What other tests are common?
Well, additional targeted tests, like screening for malaria, are ordered specifically based on the prevalence of diseases in the child's country of origin. You wouldn't screen for malaria in a child from Eastern Europe, but you definitely would for a child from sub-Saharan Africa.
Makes sense. And immunizations?
Immunization records are always carefully reviewed, but frankly, it's very common to find incomplete documentation, vaccines given using alternative schedules not used here, or records that just seem unreliable.
So what do pediatricians do? Assume they're not vaccinated.
There are two main options. One is to check antibody titers blood tests to see if the child actually has immunity to diseases like measles, mumps, rubella, hepatitis B, polio.
You okay?
Or the other option, which is often more practical and common given the frequent unreliability of foreign records and the cost of titers, is to simply choose to re-immunize the child based on standard U.S. schedules, essentially starting their vaccine series over or completing it as needed.
Okay. Now this raises an important question. Why is such a broad battery of tests necessary, especially if the child seems healthy or had some screening before they came?
It's a great question. It's fundamentally due to several factors. The inherent potential unreliability of prior records, as we discussed. The varied and often challenging health conditions prevalent in many countries of origin. And the potential for a child's early, often adverse environment, like institutionalization or malnutrition, to mask underlying health issues.
So things might be hidden.
Exactly. For example, the textbook highlights key screenings, like a complete blood cell count, CBC, to check for anemia or other blood issues. Testing for hepatitis A, B, and C virus antibodies is crucial. HIV tests, syphilis screenings.
Standard infectious diseases.
Right. And crucially, microscopic evaluation of multiple stool samples for ova and parasites, because intestinal infections are incredibly common and can cause long-term problems if untreated.
Okay.
And then, depending on the child's specific heritage or country of origin, additional tests might be considered. Things like screening for genetic conditions like glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase, G6PD deficiency, which is common in certain populations, or sickle cell trait.
So it's tailored somewhat.
It's tailored, but starts with a very broad base. These comprehensive screenings ensure that really no stone is left unturned in understanding the child's complete health status up front. It allows for proactive treatment and management of any hidden or emerging conditions that could significantly impact their future well-being.
Building on that, you mentioned growth delays are common. Let's talk more about that.
Yes, growth delays are unfortunately a frequent and significant issue seen in internationally adopted children upon arrival. These delays can represent the combined result of many compounding factors.
Like what?
Like unknown or untreated chronic medical conditions. Maybe those intestinal parasites or undiagnosed celiac disease or thyroid problems. Persistent malnutrition due to an inadequate diet in their early environment is a huge factor. And even profound psychologic deprivation or trauma, which we know can directly and negatively impact a child's physical growth through hormonal pathways.
Stress impacts growth.
Absolutely. It's therefore much more important to monitor a child's growth over time, diligently plotting serial measurements, height, weight, head circumference, including any replacement measurements that might be available from their records, however questionable.
Why the trend over time?
Because that trend data provides a far more objective and accurate assessment of the child's nutritional recovery and medical status than any single measurement at one point in time. You want to see that catch-up growth curve.
And do most kids catch up?
Many children who present initially with low height for age or growth stunting do experience significant, sometimes dramatic, catch-up in physical growth after adoption once they're in a nurturing environment with adequate nutrition. However, it's also true and important for families to understand that a notable proportion will remain shorter than their peers who didn't experience such early adversity. It highlights the lasting biological imprint of those early life circumstances.
Okay. What about developmental delays? Are those common too?
Yes, very common. Many children adopted internationally do exhibit delays in at least one area of development when they first arrive, maybe gross motor skills, fine motor, language, problem solving.
But is there hope for catching up?
Oh, absolutely. The remarkably good news is that most children exhibit significant gains, often quite rapidly, within the first 12 months after adoption. This happens especially with appropriate environmental enrichment, responsive caregiving, and consistent support from their new families.
Does age at adoption matter?
It does seem to. Children adopted at older ages, say after infancy, are likely to have more variable and sometimes less predictable long-term developmental outcomes. The duration of early deprivation can have a more entrenched impact the longer it goes on.
So early assessment is key, but maybe not fully predictive.
Exactly. In the immediate post-adoption period, it might frankly be impossible to determine with certainty whether these initial developmental delays will be transient, just a temporary result of deprivation, or more long-lasting. This is why careful serial monitoring of development using standardized screening tools within those first few years post-adoption is absolutely key.
Tracking progress over time again.
Precisely. This longitudinal approach allows clinicians and parents to identify the child's true developmental trajectory over time, which is far more predictive of long-term functioning than any single initial snapshot assessment.
And what's the recommendation if delays are found?
And a crucial recommendation here, one that we really cannot overstate given the potential for a significant long-term impact, is this. When in doubt, it is always better to refer early for developmental intervention services.
Don't wait and see.
Do not wait and see if they'll catch up on their own. Early intervention services, tailored to their specific needs, physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, special instruction, can make a profound positive difference in a child's developmental trajectory and their ultimate potential. Early is better.
Let's focus on language development specifically. It presents its own unique set of considerations, right?
It really does. For both domestic and international adoptees, sometimes genetic or biologic risk factors for poor language development might be identified pre-adoptively in domestic cases if, for example, there's a known family history of learning disabilities.
Okay.
But for international adoptees, it's highly unlikely that any underlying language delays would have been identified before adoption. Why? Because they typically haven't had any formal assessment in their native language, and they've usually had very little, if any, exposure to English.
So you don't have a baseline in their first language.
Exactly. So if assessment in their native language isn't available, which it usually isn't, It may simply not be possible to fully assess their true underlying language abilities until they've had some time and opportunity to acquire at least a foundational level of English.
But do they catch up in English?
The good news here, and again, this is often a testament to children's amazing resilience and brain plasticity, is that regardless of the age at adoption, most internationally adopted children will eventually reach age-expected language skills in English over time, often within a few years of placement.
That's encouraging.
It is. However, for clinicians and educators working with these kids, this means a unique approach might be necessary. If a child clearly has language delays after having some time to learn English, referral to early intervention or the school district's speech services should be made promptly. But clinicians may also need to work specifically with those services, with the schools, to help them understand the unique circumstances. For example, simply placing a recently adopted, say, 8-year-old child in a standard English as a second language, ESL class, might not be sufficient if that child's language development in their primary native language was already atypical or significantly delayed due to their early life circumstances, like institutionalization.
So it's not just about learning a second language.
It might not be. It might be an underlying language disorder compounded by the second language acquisition. It's about understanding the entire linguistic foundation, or lack thereof, that they're building upon. It requires a more nuanced assessment than typical ESL.
That makes sense. Okay, let's shift to some common behavioral concerns. Eating issues, sleep problems, repetitive behaviors. Are these common initially?
Yes. Initial concerns about eating, sleep regulation, and sometimes repetitive behaviors like rocking or head banging are quite common, especially among children adopted after experiencing significant neglect or developmental trauma, which is often the case with kids coming from institutional settings.
Why eating issues specifically?
Well, the feeding behaviors of international adoptees, for example, may be directly linked to orphanage feeding practices. These frequently involve things like restricted amounts of food, meals given on a rigid schedule regardless of hunger cues, or very limited exposure to different textures or solid foods during later infancy or toddlerhood.
Right.
And children who have experienced chronic lack of food, true hunger, may not have developed an internal awareness of satiation cues. They literally don't recognize when they're full.
What does that lead to?
It can lead to behaviors like hoarding food, hiding it, stuffing pockets, eating incredibly rapidly, or even frequent vomiting because they just keep eating past the point of fullness.
How should parents handle that? Let them eat.
Generally, yes, within reason. These feeding concerns often subside gradually with the introduction of age-appropriate foods, consistent and predictable meal routines, and lots of parental support for positive feeding practices. Many children adopted after significant malnutrition will initially eat an excessive amount of food. Unless the child is eating to the point of regular, repeated vomiting, which is a clear sign of a significant lack of satiation awareness and might need intervention, it is generally best to allow them to eat until they indicate they feel satisfied.
Trust them to regulate eventually.
Trust them to regulate eventually. Typically, within several months, as the child learns consistently that food is available, that they won't be deprived again, they will start to self-regulate their food intake appropriately. Occasionally, though, additional support from a speech pathologist specializing in feeding, or an occupational therapist, or even a psychologist is warranted to address possible underlying sensory issues, physical difficulties with chewing or swallowing, or psychological issues related to food and trauma.
Okay. And what about sleep problems and those repetitive behaviors you mentioned, like rocking?
Sleep is very frequently disrupted in newly adopted children. They're reacting to profound changes in everything: routines, environments, caregivers, sounds, smell.
Total upheaval.
Total upheaval. The familiar, even if it was a harsh familiarity, is gone, and this can be deeply disorienting and unsettling, making sleep difficult.
Can anything help?
Efforts to create some small sense of continuity between the pre-adoption and post-adoption environment can sometimes be helpful. Even little things, like if they came with a specific blanket or toy, maintaining that. Establishing a very consistent, predictable, calming bedtime routine is crucial.
Does it usually get better?
The good news is that, yes, typically within the first 3 to 6 months, as the child's emotional self-regulation improves, as they begin to feel safe and secure, and as attachment deepens in their new home, many of these initial sleep concerns usually subside significantly.
And the repetitive behaviors.
In a similar vein, those stereotypical behaviors, things like rhythmic rocking, maybe some head banging, repetitive hand movements, which might have served as essential self-soothing coping mechanisms in highly deprived or understimulating institutional settings.
Their way of coping.
Exactly. Those also often diminish significantly, usually within the first few months after adoption, as the child finds comfort, stability, connection, and consistent responsive interaction in their new family. They find healthier ways to regulate and connect.
Beyond medical, holistic development and family support.
So, moving beyond those immediate medical and basic behavioral concerns, fostering a child's broader social and emotional development is absolutely crucial for their long-term well-being.
The bigger picture adjustment.
Exactly. And we know that dyadic interactions between a child and their primary caretaker, meaning those direct back and forth reciprocal exchanges, are a critical component for building later regulatory functioning and healthy social emotional development.
Can you give an example of dyadic interaction?
Sure, it's that conversational dance, even before language. A parent smiles warmly at a baby, and the baby coos or smiles back. A toddler points excitedly at a dog, and the parent engages them, saying, "Yes, look at the big doggy."
That serve and return thing.
Precisely, serve and return. These seemingly small, responsive interactions literally build the foundational brain architecture for emotional regulation, impulse control, empathy, and social skills.
But the challenge for adopted kids.
The challenge is that the amount and, crucially, the quality of individualized responsive care a child received before their adoption, whether they came from an international orphanage, a domestic situation involving neglect, or through multiple foster care placements, is usually unknown or known to be deficient.
So that foundation might be weak.
It might be weak or underdeveloped. However, the encouraging part is that in many cases, simply entering a secure, stable home setting with consistent, responsive childcare routines, predictable schedules, and loving interaction is sufficient to support the child's emerging social emotional development over time.
The new environment helps heal.
It provides the conditions for healing and growth. And pediatricians can play a vital role here, too, by helping parents remember that while adoption is undeniably part of the child's identity and history, it doesn't necessarily define or explain every aspect of their behavior or challenges.
Not everything is about the adoption.
Exactly. Throughout a child's childhood, though, prior experiences or even perhaps a biological predisposition might result in behaviors that are genuinely confusing or challenging for adoptive parents to interpret or respond to effectively. The child's reactions to stress or change might be subtle or delayed or just difficult to understand, and this can sometimes interfere with the parent's ability to respond in that sensitive, attuned way that builds security.
So what can help then?
In these circumstances, seeking additional behavioral health support can be profoundly helpful. This might mean consulting with a child psychologist or a therapist who specializes specifically in adoption, attachment, and trauma. They can help the family understand the child's behavior through a trauma lens, strengthen the parent-child relationship, and develop strategies to foster emerging self-regulation skills within the newly formed family.
Getting specialized support.
Sometimes it's really necessary and makes a huge difference.
Now, an incredibly important aspect of holistic development, particularly relevant in our society today, is racial identity development, especially in the context of transracial adoption.
Yes, this is a critical area.
Transracial adoption, just to define it, is where the racial background of the child differs from that of a parent or parents.
Yeah.
And it accounts for a pretty significant percentage of adoptions each year in the U.S., right?
It does. And in most of these placements, statistically, it involves children of color being adopted by white parents.
Okay. And why is racial identity development so crucial here?
Well, racial identity development, which includes how a child comes to understand their own race, how they feel about it, and how they learn to navigate and healthily respond to racial bias and discrimination, is increasingly recognized as absolutely crucial in the overall development and psychological well-being of all children, but especially for transracially adopted children.
Does it become more important over time?
It seems to. Surveys of adults who were adopted transracially indicate that their racial identity is often of central importance at many ages, but it tends to increase in significance, becoming particularly salient during adolescence and young adulthood as they navigate their place in the broader, often racialized world.
And it can be complex for them.
Integrating race and ethnicity into one's core sense of self can be a complex process for anyone, but it may be especially complicated when you're raised in a loving family where racial differences are visually apparent and perhaps not always fully understood, affirmed, or mirrored by the surrounding community or even within the family itself.
What helps, according to research?
Research with transracially adopted adults highlights the value they placed on things like attending racially diverse schools where they weren't the only one, and having adult role models, maybe teachers, doctors, coaches, community leaders who shared their racial background. seeing successful adults who looked like them.
So representation matters.
Representation absolutely matters. Parents who adopt transracially are therefore strongly encouraged by experts and by the textbook to proactively seek out and support interactions for their child within diverse communities. And maybe most importantly, to discuss race, ethnicity, and associated discrimination often and openly within the family.
Don't be colorblind. Talk about it.
Exactly. Don't pretend race doesn't exist or doesn't matter. Acknowledge it, talk about it, learn about it together. For example, the text mentions a black child raised by white parents in a predominantly white community. They might be somewhat sheltered from overt daily racism in their immediate bubble, but they absolutely need to be taught explicitly by their parents that many others in the world, including authority figures like law enforcement officers, will see them and treat them as black, with all the intense biases and dangers unfortunately associated with race in our society.
Preparing them for reality.
It's a vital, ongoing conversation about safety, identity, and resilience that must be had proactively and continually throughout their development to equip them for the realities they will inevitably face outside the home.
And there are specific resources to help with this, right? Like culture camps.
Yes, to support this crucial aspect of identity formation and provide a sense of belonging and connection, adoption culture camps have emerged as a really valuable resource.
What are those?
Well, for instance, there are adoption culture camps specifically designed for transracial black children. They offer a unique opportunity to experience their racial heritage in a positive, celebratory way, and maybe most importantly, to meet and connect with other adopted children who share similar lived experiences.
Building community?
Exactly. They provide a safe, affirming space to explore their identity, talk about their experiences, and connect with peers who really get their unique life narratives and adoption journeys in a way others might not.
Are there camps for other groups too?
Yes, the text also mentions Asian heritage camps, like those specifically for Chinese and Korean internationally adopted children, that provide a similar cultural immersion experience. They help children connect with their birth culture, maybe learn about traditions, food, sometimes even engage with their native language in a fun way.
What's the key benefit here?
What's truly fascinating and powerful here is how these initiatives provide these crucial spaces for identity affirmation and community building that are often really difficult to replicate consistently in everyday life, especially if the family lives in a non-diverse area. They offer a profound sense of belonging, a deeper understanding and appreciation of their unique heritage, which can be immensely empowering as they navigate their complex identities in a diverse world. It reinforces the message that their identity, including their race and adoption story, is a source of strength, connection, and pride, not confusion or shame.
That sounds incredibly valuable. Now, another critical concept that adoptive families and the professionals supporting them really need to understand deeply is toxic stress. This isn't just everyday stress, right?
No, not at all. Toxic stress, as defined in developmental science, refers to the cumulative, prolonged amount of unsupported early adversity that a child experiences. The key there is unsupported.
Okay. What kind of experiences lead to it in adopted kids?
Well, in the context of adoption, this can include things like numerous years spent within deprived international orphanage care with little stimulation or consistent caregiving, experiencing extensive abuse or neglect before being removed from their biological family, or enduring multiple, unpredictable, and disruptive foster care placements before finding permanency.
Lots of instability and trauma.
Exactly. All of these are highly traumatic experiences that can overload a child's developing stress response systems, keeping them in a constant state of high alert physiologically.
And the impact is significant.
The profound impact of toxic stress can affect both the immediate placement stability, making adjustment harder, and critically, a child's long-term physical health, their brain development, and their lifelong emotional well-being.
So understanding this concept, this immediately raises an important question. How can knowing about presumed toxic stress profoundly help parents interpret their child's behavior and support healthy family functioning?
Oh, this knowledge is absolutely transformative for parents. Understanding toxic stress provides a crucial framework, a different lens, for interpreting behaviors that might otherwise seem completely baffling, intentionally defiant, manipulative, or just plain difficult.
How so?
For example, a child who is constantly hoarding food even when plenty is available, or a child who has huge explosive emotional meltdowns over seemingly small things, or a child who is hypervigilant, always scanning the environment, jumpy. These behaviors might not be the child acting out in a traditional sense.
They could be trauma responses.
They could very well be adaptive responses that their brain developed to survive past trauma, chronic insecurity, and lack of control. A trauma-informed lens, informed by this concept of toxic stress, allows parents to approach their child with much greater empathy, patience, and compassion.
Seeing the behavior differently.
Seeing it differently. Recognizing that their child's actions are often a reflection of their profound history and their brain's wiring for survival, rather than a personal slight or willful disobedience aimed at the parent. This understanding empowers parents to respond with connection, calmness, and co-regulation, helping the child feel safe and manage their big feelings rather than with punishment or frustration, which often escalates things.
It shifts the focus.
It totally shifts the focus from asking, what's wrong with this child, to asking, what happened to this child and how can I help them heal, feel safe, and thrive? This perspective is absolutely key to fostering a healthy, resilient, and securely attached family unit when dealing with the impact of early adversity.
Indeed, the unique aspects that are just inherent in adoptive family formation can create significant familial stress sometimes, right? Affecting both the child and the family functioning in ways that might differ from biological families.
That's true. There are unique layers. For instance, some adoptive families may first have had to navigate the profound emotional complexities and grief of infertility before even turning to adoption, which brings its own emotional weight to the process.
Right, that's a specific journey.
Then they might face the realities of creating a multiracial family, which, as we just discussed, comes with its own societal considerations, learning curves, and challenges. There are also the ongoing discussions and decisions around the disclosure of adoptive status to the child. When, how much detail. And handling the child's inevitable and completely normal and healthy questions about their pre-adoptive experiences and their biological origins.
And those can be tough conversations.
They can be. Furthermore, adoptive families, especially those adopting from foster care, can sometimes experience ongoing scrutiny or oversight by adoption agencies or the courts, even after placement, which can add an extra layer of pressure and anxiety.
And for same-sex parents.
For gay and lesbian parents, as the text notes, there are often additional psychosocial stressors, including, unfortunately, continued barriers to legal recognition of both parents as legal parents in some jurisdictions, or facing discrimination, which can negatively affect family functioning and legal security.
So, lots of potential stressors. How do families cope?
Well, the good news is the vast majority of adoptive families acclimate well to these adoption-related stressors over time and develop incredibly resilient, strong family units.
That's important to hear.
Very important. But it is also critically important to acknowledge that some parents may experience post-adoption depression.
Similar to postpartum depression.
It's a distinct phenomenon, perhaps related more to the stress, adjustment, and sometimes unmet expectations, but it's very real and can be equally impactful on family well-being. It's not talked about as much, but it happens.
What helps then?
In such cases, seeking additional mental health support, often from therapists who specialize in adoption and parental mental health, can be incredibly beneficial. It can help ease the family's transition, support the parent's well-being, and ensure the mental and emotional health of all family members. It just highlights again that adoption isn't a singular event, but an ongoing journey that requires continuous awareness and support for the entire family system.
One of the most foundational recommendations for adoptive families, consistently emphasized in the textbook, revolves around the paramount importance of the adoption narrative. Talking about adoption.
Yes, open communication.
Families are strongly encouraged to speak openly, honestly, and repeatedly about adoption with their child, starting when they're toddlers and continuing actively right through adolescence and beyond.
Not a one-time talk.
Definitely not. It's an evolving, ongoing dialogue that needs to adapt as the child grows, as their understanding develops, and as their questions change. Creating a life book for the adopted child is often recommended. What is that?
A life book is basically a scrapbook or binder, often created collaboratively by the parents and child over time. It provides a tangible, visual way to support family communication about the child's history. It can include pictures, documents, stories about their birth family, if known, their time in foster care or an orphanage, their journey to their adoptive family, important milestones.
The record of their story.
Exactly. It helps document their unique history, their significant relationships, including acknowledging their family of origin, and their life transitions like immigration or moving between placements. It validates their whole story.
And kids will have questions, right?
It's common and completely normal and healthy for adopted children to have questions about adoption, their pre-adoptive experiences, and their biological family throughout their development. Curiosity is natural.
Does it change with age?
Often, yes. An increase in cognitive understanding, particularly around ages 7 to 10 years, when kids start thinking more complexly about family and identity, can sometimes intensify adoption-related questions and maybe even cause some temporary distress as they begin to grasp the complexities and implications of loss and difference more deeply.
And in today's world, information is everywhere.
Right. In our modern context, youth who have questions about their biological family members are increasingly able to access information, or try to, via social media and web-based searching, sometimes finding information or connections independently. This just further highlights the critical importance of ongoing, open, and honest communication within the family about adoption from a very young age. So the parents are the primary source of information and support.
And the pediatrician's role here.
Well, pediatricians in this context may need to respond to increased concerns and questions from both the children and the parents, especially when the adoptee's health and genetic history from their birth family is incomplete or totally unknown. They can provide guidance, normalize the questions, and connect families with resources if needed.
And it's important to remember.
And it's a critical reminder for everyone involved, parents, pediatricians, teachers. At any time, concerns about a child's development, their behavior, or their social emotional functioning may or may not be directly related to the child's adoption history.
Don't automatically blame adoption.
Exactly. It's crucial to assess each situation comprehensively, consider all potential contributing factors, temperament, current environment, school issues, medical issues, and avoid reflexively attributing all challenges solely to the fact that the child was adopted. That can be overly simplistic and sometimes misses the real issue.
Okay, so looking at the overall picture then, how do adopted kids and families generally fare?
Ultimately, and this really is a testament to the resilience of children and the strength and commitment of adoptive families, the vast majority of adopted children and their families adjust remarkably well and go on to lead healthy, productive, and connected lives. Adoption is largely a very successful way to build a family.
But sometimes placements don't work out. You mentioned disruption.
Yes. While adoptions infrequently disrupt, meaning the legal adoption is never finalized or the child leaves the home after finalization, it does happen. And disruption rates are notably higher among children adopted from the foster care system compared to infant or international adoptions.
Why is that?
Research clearly associates this higher risk with factors such as the child's older age at adoption, and particularly a history of multiple placements and significant trauma before the adoptive placement. It indicates that the more complex a child's history of instability and adversity, the higher the risk that the adoptive placement might struggle without intensive support.
But agencies are getting better at supporting these families.
Yes, thankfully. With an increased understanding of the unique needs and challenges of families who adopt children from foster care, agencies are now placing much greater emphasis on the comprehensive preparation and training of adoptive parents before placement. And crucially, ensuring the availability of a full range of robust post-adoption services. This includes not just physical health support, but readily accessible mental health services, developmental therapies, parent support groups, respite care, often available for many years after the adoption is finalized.
That ongoing support seems key.
That focus on ongoing wraparound support is absolutely crucial for promoting long-term success and stability for these families who have often taken on raising children with very significant needs.
Which brings us full circle, doesn't it? Back to the foster care system itself, which is so intrinsically linked to domestic adoption and is often that critical first step in a child's journey toward finding a permanent, loving home.
Connecting the dots. Foster care and kinship care, drawing from Chapter 10.
So let's connect those dots explicitly now by looking at the foster care system, drawing from Chapter 10 of Nelson's. The foundation of foster care is actually deeply rooted in history, isn't it? Out-of-home care has served kids' needs worldwide for centuries.
That's right. It's not a new concept. In the United States specifically, foster care developed more formally as a temporary resource intended for children during times of profound family crisis abuse, neglect, parental incapacity.
And what's the core principle behind it?
It's really rooted in a core fundamental principle, the belief that children generally fare best when they are raised in family settings, even if that family isn't their original biological unit. Family is preferred over institutional care.
Okay. So what's the mission of foster care today?
The overarching mission is really threefold. First, provide for the immediate safety of the child. Second, work towards permanency for the child, ideally reunification, but if not, then adoption or guardianship. And third, promote the overall well-being of the child while they are in care.
And what about the birth families?
Simultaneously, the system is mandated to assist the birth families with services, things like parenting classes, substance abuse treatment, mental health support, meticulously designed to promote reunification whenever it's safe and possible to do so. This dual focus on child well-being and family preservation when safe is central to its purpose.
Okay, let's look at the epidemiology, the numbers. Globally, it's hard to know exactly how many kids are in care. Right.
Very hard globally. Estimates are maybe around 8 million children potentially in foster care or congregate care settings worldwide, but it's imprecise. In the United States, however, we have much more precise figures collected through the AFCARS system.
And what do those show?
On September 30th, 2021, for instance, approximately 391,098 children resided in foster care in the U.S.
Nearly 400,000 kids on one day.
Yes. Now, this figure is actually down significantly from a peak of over 511,000 children back in 2005.
Why did it go down?
Well, early in the millennium, foster care numbers started decreasing, even though maltreatment reports were increasing. This was partly because child welfare agencies began offering families more preventative services up front, trying to avoid removal, and also prioritizing placement with relatives' kinship care or other non-relative caregivers as alternatives to court-ordered removal into the formal foster system.
But then it went up again.
It did. There was a significant increase in children in care, reaching about 437,000 in 2018. And that increase appears to be directly related to the devastating impact of the opioid epidemic, which profoundly impacted family stability and led to a surge in child removals due to parental substance abuse and neglect.
Wow. Are there any positive trends more recently?
The good news is that over the last 10 years or so, generally, reunification rates have increased slightly, and the adoption rates for children exiting foster care have also generally increased, showing some positive movement towards achieving permanency more quickly for kids.
Where do these kids actually live while they're in foster care?
Nationally, the breakdown is roughly about 44% live with a non-relative foster caregiver, a traditional foster home. About 35% are placed with a relative, which is kinship care.
It's a big chunk with relatives.
A very significant and growing proportion, which is generally seen as positive. Then about 9% are in congregate or group care settings. These are typically residential facilities, group homes, shelters. And about 2% are in supervised independent living arrangements, usually for older youth, 16 or 17, preparing for emancipation.
What about the demographics age, race?
Demographically, about 37% of children in foster care are quite young, younger than 5 years old, a really vulnerable group developmentally, and about 28% are older, over 12 years. In terms of race and ethnicity, nationally, most children in care are identified as white, about 44%. About 22% are black, 22% are Hispanic of any race, and 8% are identified as 2 or more races.
Now, you mentioned earlier the overrepresentation issue.
Yes, and this raises that really important and persistent question. Why are Black, Latinx, and Indigenous children consistently overrepresented in the foster care system compared with their actual representation in the general U.S. population? This is despite child welfare agencies supposedly attending to drivers of these disparities, like implicit bias and structural racism, for nearly 2 decades now.
So the problem persists.
It absolutely persists. It points to the incredibly complex and deep-rooted challenges of systemic inequities, the disproportionate impact of poverty, lack of resources, community surveillance, and historical societal stressors on these communities, which leads to higher rates of system involvement.
How long do kids typically stay in care?
The average length of stay has been declining, which is good. The median was about 14.9 months in 2021.
So half stay less than about 15 months, half stay longer?
Right. However, it's still a significant concern that about 33%, 1/3 of children spend more than 2 years in foster care, indicating prolonged instability and uncertainty for a substantial minority.
And how do kids leave the system? What are the exit outcomes?
When children do exit foster care, about half achieve reunification with their parents or primary caretakers. About 25% are adopted, mostly by foster parents or relatives, as we discussed. Another 9% are placed permanently with relatives under legal guardianship arrangements.
Okay. What about the rest?
Tragically, among the remaining children, about 8% emancipate they age out of the system, usually between ages 18 and 21, often facing significant challenges without a permanent family connection. And a truly heartbreaking statistic that underscores the acute vulnerability of these children. 368 deaths were reported among children while they were in foster care in fiscal year 2021.
That is heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And it brings us to a critical point with really profound consequences. The impact of placement instability while in care.
Yes. Moving frequently between different foster homes or settings is unequivocally associated with poor outcomes for children across virtually every domain.
What kind of poor outcomes?
Detrimental effects on educational attainment, lower grades, lower graduation rates, higher dropout rates, increased behavioral and mental health issues, higher rates of anxiety, depression, PTSD, attachment disorders, conduct problems, and significantly delayed permanency. Kids who move more often tend to wait much longer for a stable, permanent home, whether that's reunification or adoption.
And how common is this instability?
The prevalence is alarming. The majority of children who remain in foster care for longer than 2 years have experienced 3 or more different placements. Imagine the cumulative toll of loss, uncertainty, and broken attachments that comes with moving 3, 4, 5 times or more.
Are there factors that predict this instability?
Yes, research has identified clear predictors. Being older when entering foster care, spending a longer total time in custody, having a history of sexual or physical abuse prior to entering care, and having pre-existing behavioral or physical health challenges. These all significantly increase the likelihood of experiencing multiple moves, which then further compounds the child's trauma and hinders their fundamental ability to form secure attachments and trust caregivers. It's a vicious cycle sometimes.
And for the youth who do age out, who emancipate without a permanent family, you mentioned they face significant challenges. Can you elaborate?
Yes, youth who age out of foster care face significant and well-documented additional challenges that often persist long into adulthood, highlighting the system's failure to prepare them adequately for independence without lifelong connections.
What do the outcomes look like?
By age 24, the statistics are pretty sobering. A startlingly low 5% have graduated from any 2 or 4-year college program, reflecting huge educational barriers and lack of support. Only about half are consistently employed, showing difficulties in securing stable livelihoods. The rates of homelessness are profoundly high. 39%, nearly 2 in 5, have experienced homelessness or unstable housing like couch surfing since leaving care.
Wow. And involvement with the law.
Also very high. 81% of males and 57% of females who aged out report having been arrested at least once by age 24, indicating a cycle of systemic vulnerability, lack of opportunity, and often criminalization of survival behavior.
And parenting.
Furthermore, 2/3 of the young women and about half of the young men report having had at least one child by age 24, often navigating parenthood themselves without the familial support networks or resources that other young parents might rely on, potentially perpetuating cycles of hardship and system involvement for the next generation.
Are there things being done to mitigate this?
Yes. While these statistics are incredibly sobering, efforts like extending foster care eligibility and support services to age 21 in many states have been shown to provide crucial benefits, although they don't eliminate all the risks.
How does extending care help?
This extended support can provide a vital bridge to independence. It allows more time for skill building, completing education, accessing job training, developing supportive relationships, and connecting to community resources. It offers a more gradual and supported transition into adulthood compared to being cut off abruptly at 18.
Now, several key pieces of federal legislation have really shaped the foster care system over recent decades, driven by this growing understanding of children's needs for permanency and well-being. We mentioned SFA.
Right, the Adoption and Safe Families Act, PL 10589. As we said, it requires that permanency plan within 12 months and sets the timeline for pursuing termination of parental rights 15 out of 22 months, really pushing for timely permanency.
What came after SFA?
Then came the Fostering Connections to Success and Increasing Adoptions Act of 2008, often just called Fostering Connections, PL 110-351. This act focused on several things. It provided new incentives and support for guardianship and adoption, especially by relatives. It authorized that option for states to extend foster care support to age 21 for young adults.
Okay.
Crucially, it also affirmed the rights of U.S. indigenous nation children in foster care to have their cases potentially transferred to tribal courts and to be placed according to tribal preferences, respecting tribal sovereignty under ICWA. And it included that clause requiring states to develop and coordinate comprehensive health care systems specifically for children in foster care, working with Medicaid and pediatricians to meet their unique health needs.
And more recently.
Most recently, the Family First Prevention Services Act, signed into law in 2018, represents a really significant philosophical shift towards prevention. This legislation fundamentally changes how federal foster care funds can be used. It emphasizes providing evidence-based mental health services, substance abuse treatment programs, and in-home parenting skill training for families whose children are identified as being at imminent risk of entering foster care. The goal is to address the root causes of family instability before removal becomes necessary.
Try to keep families together safely.
Exactly. Family First also addresses the need for children already in care to be provided with appropriate evidence-based mental health services. And it provides strong financial incentives to states to move children out of congregate care settings like group homes or residential treatment centers and into more appropriate family-like settings whenever possible, prioritizing a true family environment for all children.
That sounds like a major step forward.
It has the potential to be, yes, though implementation is complex and ongoing.
Underlying so many of these challenges for children in foster care, and the reasons they enter the system in the first place, is the pervasive and often devastating impact of early childhood trauma.
Absolutely. It's impossible to talk about foster care without talking about trauma. These children enter the system with incredibly high rates of exposure to early childhood trauma and adversity.
What are the main reasons for placement again?
The reasons for their placement tell a stark story. Over 60% are placed primarily due to neglect failure to provide basic needs. About 12% for physical abuse, 4% for sexual abuse, and 5% due to abandonment.
And substance use.
Parental alcohol and other substance use is identified as a contributing factor in a staggering 42% of removals, and this figure is widely believed to be significantly underestimated as it often intertwines with and underlies other forms of neglect or abuse.
Right.
Parental substance use also frequently contributes to prenatal substance exposures for their children, adding another layer of complexity, potential neurodevelopmental challenges, and health issues right from birth.
What about violence?
Violence in the home is also tragically common. Many children entering foster care have witnessed or experienced intimate partner violence between their caregivers and/or significant community violence before they ever enter the system's care.
And the removal itself can be traumatic.
Yes. What's fascinating here is the really complex emotional landscape that follows removal. While removal from the family of origin can, in some cases, actually compound prior trauma experiences, another loss, another disruption. It's also true that some children experience a profound sense of relief upon removal from a chaotic, abusive, neglectful, or dangerous home environment. For them, foster care might initially feel like a move towards safety and predictability.
But they still miss their family.
Almost always.
Yeah.
No matter the circumstances of the removal, most children inherently miss their family members. They worry about their parents or siblings, and they often long for reunification, even if that family environment was objectively harmful or inadequate. The bonds are deep, even when they're complicated.
So it's a mix of emotions.
A huge mix. And then the experience of being in foster care itself adds more layers of potential trauma. The separation from everything familiar, the profound sense of loss and grief, often unpredictable or limited contact with their family of origin, the instability of frequent placement changes, the emotionally taxing and confusing legal process of court hearings and potentially terminating parental rights, and just the sheer pervasive uncertainty about their future. All of this profoundly erodes a child's sense of safety, stability, and well-being, and can leave lasting emotional scars that require extensive, specialized, trauma-informed support to heal. Outro.
Wow. What an incredibly deep dive we've really had today into the intricate, truly multifaceted world of adoption and foster care.
It really covers so much ground.
It really does. We've meticulously explored the core definitions, unpacked exactly how children navigate these different pathways to find new families, from foster care to domestic infant adoption to the complexities of international adoption. We detailed the vital and often very complex role of medical professionals, right from those crucial pre-adoption reviews through the comprehensive post-adoption care needed.
Absolutely key.
And we delve into the profound developmental and social considerations that come into play, critical issues like racial identity development in transracial families, understanding and responding to the lasting impact of toxic stress.
And connecting it all back, as we did, to the essential, often challenging system of foster care and kinship care, which really serves as the foundation for so many adoption journeys in the U.S. today.
Exactly.
And if we connect all of this to the bigger picture, I think it highlights, maybe above all else, the incredible resilience of children and families who navigate these profoundly complex journeys.
It really does.
It also powerfully underscores the incredible importance of informed, compassionate, and truly comprehensive support systems at every single stage. That means policymakers and agencies shaping the landscape effectively, dedicated medical and mental health professionals providing critical, specialized care, and maybe most importantly, the adoptive families themselves getting the education and support they need.
Yeah.
Understanding the nuances, the challenges, and also the immense capacity for growth and healing in these children and families is absolutely key to fostering their long-term well-being.
And for you, our listener, you now possess an understanding of this field that is typically reserved for experts. You're equipped to grasp the nuances, the complexities that profoundly shape these children's lives, and the intricate systems designed, hopefully, to support them.
It's beyond the headlines now.
Way beyond. You're no longer just hearing the surface stories. You're understanding the underlying legal frameworks from ASFE to Family First, the critical medical necessities from screenings to developmental monitoring, and the profound emotional landscapes involved in creating and supporting these unique families.
Hopefully a much richer perspective.
Definitely. So, to leave you with something to think about, considering everything we've discussed today, particularly the increasing complexity of needs often seen in adopted children now, and the evolving landscape of family structures, here's a final provocative thought. What proactive steps do you think communities, maybe your community, can take to ensure that every child, regardless of their specific path to finding a family, has access to the comprehensive, coordinated, trauma-informed support they truly deserve to thrive and reach their full potential?
That's a big question for all of us.
It really is. It challenges us all to think beyond just individual cases and look towards more systemic supportive solutions. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for listening.
Until next time, keep digging, keep learning, and keep being curious.